Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Hittites in our continuing study of the history of civilization. Today we know that the Hittites, the Hittite Empire, or kingdom if we want to call it that, maybe empire is too big of a word, was located in what we call modern-day Turkey, but I'm going to refer to it as the land of Anatolia. By that I'm using the Greek term for it. Anatolia, Ana is up and Tolia is the sun, so it's the land of the rising sun, because if you're in Greece, it's the direction from Anatolia where the sun comes up. So Hatti, the land of the Hittites. Now, in the 1800s, 1871, this is all that was known about the Hittites. This is in the, just taken from the French Encyclopedia. The Hittites, a Canaanite tribe encountered in Palestine by the Israelites, resident and alongside the Amorites in the region of Bethel. They were pressed into service by Solomon. Still later, however, an independent and monarchially governed Hittite tribe existed nearer Syria. And that was it. That's the sum total of everything that was known about the Hittites in the late 1800s. The Bible makes reference to them. 2 Kings chapter 7 verses 6 and 7. For the Lord had caused the army of the Arameans. What happens in the story, you have Elisha, and he's in a city in Israel, and they're surrounded by bad guys, by the Arameans. But the Lord had caused the army of the Arameans to hear a sound of chariots and a sound of horses, even the sound of a great army. So they said to one another, these Arameans said, Behold, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings, plural, of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians. And notice, it's Hittites that are mentioned first, as if they're the really scary guys. And yeah, Egyptians are scary too, to come upon us. Therefore they arose and fled in the twilight, left their tents and their horses and their donkeys, even the camp just as it was, and fled for their life. And so when you read the Bible, notice it's actually putting Hittites before the Egyptians. And judging on what scholars knew at the time in the 1800s, that just shouldn't have been the case. Well, it was Charles Felix Texer. He was traveling through Turkey in 1834, and he'd been searching for the lost Roman city of Tavium. And he came to a town, Bogescu was a village, a town up there, and he came across some ruins. And he didn't know what they were. They looked sort of odd, sort of strange. And he thought at first, well, I finally found this lost city of Tavium. But he didn't have to spend very much time there before he realized this isn't Roman. This is much older than Roman. What he saw there, here's a picture of what's known as the Lion's Gate. Notice the architecture, very big, heavy, what we call monolith, very large stones, cyclopedian stones, like the Cyclops, would be a big guy that would need to pick them up. Like you see in Mycenae, we haven't gotten there yet. But it is somewhat similar, and the statues of two lions carved in to the gate. Later on, they found this is a Hittite chariot. Now you had chariots over in Egypt, and notice the chariot sort of looks alike. It's the six-spoked wheel, and there's the horse and the riders, but the artwork is very different. This is certainly not Egyptian artwork. And what he had discovered was a large city that just went on and on for it seemed like miles. The city of Hadassus. Engravings they were Indo-European people, and yet they had these long sort of curly beards that reminded you of the Babylonians, and from that era of first or second millennia BC. Now it was Archibald Henry Sayce who visited the site in 1889, and they said maybe these are the biblical Hittites. And everybody sort of laughed at him and said, oh, come on, you're just making things up. But as it turns out, he's going to be right. Sometimes you can be right and everybody else is wrong, and that doesn't stop you from being right. It was Hugo Winkler who led 2 expeditions in the early 1900s to this location. It was a bit hard to get to, central Turkey. He hired local natives to bring in fragments of tablets, and he tells a story about one of his assistants one morning. The workers would come in with these wheelbarrows full of fragments of tablets, and they'd dump them on the ground, and he and his assistant would sit in the tent, taking all these fragments and then trying to piece them together like a bunch of crossword puzzles. But his assistant got up and followed the worker out one morning to find out where he was getting these tablets and bringing them in, and they'd be trying to piece them together and trying to translate them. And they went over some hills and woods and so on. Finally came to this wide open space, and there were these rows and rows and rows of perfectly formed tablets. And the local native worker, well, he grabbed a few, took his pickaxe, broke them into pieces, threw them into his wheelbarrow, and brought them to Winkler. And we thought, well, good night. Don't break them up. Don't break them up. Let's keep those tablets whole. But it shows how much material there was to find, and some of just the comical way in which they went about initially finding it. Now, the good news is the archaeology got better as time went on. And so they find, one of the things they found, and I've gotten a chance to see this, you can go to the Antiquities Museum in Istanbul and see the Akkadian tablet containing a treaty between Ramses II and Hattusilus, the king of the Hittites. A treaty that is over 3,000 years old, and you can still read it if you can read Akkadian. And so you can go to that museum, and they have some of the great antiquities. Notice on the left, and I put Paula in the picture so you could see just how mammoth some of these wall inscriptions are. Big mosaic of one of the Hittites. Big Hittite king talking to little Hittite king, and we're going to see that theme, the big king and the little king. The big king is going to be known as the suzerain, and he's the big king who has entered into a treaty relationship with other little kings. Now, when it comes time for the Hittites to sort of begin their expansion, they're going to expand to the south. To the southeast. To the north, you have the Black Sea. To the west, they have the Aegean. To the south, they have the Mediterranean. But they're not going to be an ocean-going people. They're up in the hinterland, and so they're going to move to the southeast. And actually, they're going to begin with a bang. In around 1600 BC, they're going to capture Babylon. And now they're not going to keep it. They're just going to come in and take whatever's not nailed down and go back home. But that's going to change things in Babylon too. That's going to have an impact on Babylon. So with that, you've got the coming of the Hittites. Another group that begins to rise up after this are known as the Hurrians in the Bible. We know them as the kingdom of Mitanni. They had the unfortunate circumstance to be located there in northern Mesopotamia, where they're going to have pretty much enemies on every side, and that's going to hurt. But they are going to rise up and thrive for a couple hundred years, but eventually they'll disappear. So the Hurrians are there, and meanwhile the Kassites have come in about 100 years after the Hittite invasion of Babylon, and they come in and they establish a dynasty in Babylon, and it's actually the longest single group that rules Babylon for quite a long time. From 1500 to around 1200 BC, the Kassite dynasty, 300 years they're ruling in Babylon. Meanwhile, and we've already talked about Egypt, but we've got Thutmose III. Remember, he was the great Napoleon of Egypt. He was the great conqueror who marches out all the way to Mitanni 17 different times and just beats Mitanni into submission. And so here's this group that's settled there, and all of a sudden you've got Egypt coming way out of Africa just to come out of their way. And Thutmose III, in his day, Egypt is the big superpower. The Hittites are there, but they've sort of gone back home, and they're beginning to negotiate things with Mitanni and the Assyrians, and maybe even far off Babylon, but they're pretty much stayed home, and they're not really going to have too many encounters with Egypt yet. It's coming, but it's not there yet. Of course, you remember in the biblical story, you have the Exodus taking place around this time, where the Israelites leave Egypt, and then they cross the Red Sea, and they go down into the Sinai area. They attempt to go into the Promised Land, and that doesn't work out so well with the 10 spies who give a negative report. But then after 40 years, Joshua brings them around, and they enter the Promised Land, and now the land of Canaan begins to be occupied, at least the mountain portions, by these tribes of Israel. But that's a very tiny portion of the world, and meanwhile Egypt is still there, very big. Mitanni is still there, the Hittites, the Babylonians. These world civilizations are almost not even taking note of this tiny tribe. I say tiny, there's a lot of Israelites, but they don't have big cities and big armies and things like that, and so they're almost unnoticed. Egypt, for example, has one phrase in one monument at this time that makes reference to in the days of Merenptah, that makes reference to the Israelites, and it's just like a phrase in passing when he's talking about so many other people groups with whom they're dealing. So I have Egypt and Mitanni and the Hittites and at this time we actually have, during the Amarna period, this is the period when Joshua was taking the land and so on, but we have a series of letters, and we call them, it's the Amarna period because this is the time when you actually have a city at Tel El Amarna, the city that Akhenaten had sort of made his temples for the sun god, and these letters are reflecting the correspondence of all these different people groups, of the Hittites, Mitanni, Babylon, Assyria, and sometimes they are letters wishing well. For example, the Hittites might write to the Egyptians and say, "Hey, I heard that you have a new son. Congratulations." The king of Babylon writes to the king of Egypt saying, "Hey, I was sick, and you didn't send me a get well card. What's wrong with you?" And the Egyptian pharaoh writes back and says, "Well, I didn't hear about it because we live a very long way away." And the king of Babylon writes back and says, "Oh, I hadn't realized that you're that far away." Remember, we're looking at these maps. They couldn't see the maps. They didn't have any maps back then, and so sometimes they really didn't have the concept of exactly how far these distances were. So well-wishing letters. Egypt was known for its doctors, and so the king of the Hittites might say, "Hey, my sister's sick. Can you send one of your doctors up to help us out? Because your doctors are known for being pretty reliable. They're not going to send to Babylon because remember you've got some of the law codes from Babylon say, hey, if a doctor messes up his operation, you're going to cut his arm off. So no, it doesn't go in that direction. Sometimes there are gifts sent where a new king would come to the throne, and the king of Mitanni might send presents to the new king of the Hittites, and so you'll get a thank you letter back. And sometimes these could be quite pointed. For example, again, the king of Babylon sends a letter to the king of Egypt, and he says, my father, when he became king, you sent a whole lot of gold, and you didn't send so much. Did you become a lot poorer? And sort of playing to his vanity. Is Egypt now poor? I get it if you are, and you can't afford so much. So, and he's trying to sort of pressure him into sending more gold. Actually, all three of these, the Hittites, Mitanni, and Babylon, they will be sending to Egypt asking, send us gold. In fact, the statement is going to be made, gold is just like dust in the streets there in Egypt. At least that's the boast that you make. So send us some of your dust. And of course, the truth is, Egypt, you don't find gold in Egypt, not naturally. All of the gold that Egypt had, they had stolen from Nubia in the south. But they're not telling the Hittites and the Mitanni and Babylon that. Another source of the letters is that of brides, where you'll have maybe the king of the Hittites will allow the king of Mitanni to take one of his daughters as a bride, and so that becomes his son-in-law, and sort of sealing the alliance by that. We have letters that are sent to the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh of Egypt, saying, "Can you send one of your daughters to be my bride?" And the Pharaoh of Egypt says, "Absolutely not. No daughter of Egypt has ever been allowed to be a bride to one of you lesser peoples. One of you, even though he's respectful, he calls the king of the Hittites in Mitanni and Babylon my brothers. They're very friendly letters, but there's a line that he won't pass. I don't allow my daughters to be married out because you guys aren't quite up to my level." Which means later on, when we get to the story of Solomon taking a princess of Egypt as a bride, that's going to be a really, really big thing. It will also be a mark that Egypt's pharaohs aren't as great as they had been in the past. Now, we mentioned already Akhenaten, the widow of Tutankhamun, how she writes a letter to the king of the Hittites. "My husband has died and I have no son, and they say about you that you have many sons. You might give me one of your sons to become my husband, and I would not wish to take one of my subjects as a husband." That would be really low. Even though some of them are nobles, they're just not high enough to marry an Egyptian, the wife of or the widow of a pharaoh. And we know that the king of the Hittites actually sent his son down to Egypt, but that son was murdered. And we've been through that story. But that's the context in which this is taking place. There's all these letters that are going back and forth in that time in history. As now we have the growth of the nation of Israel, little tiny nation, and right now it's just tribes. This is before the days of Saul and David and Solomon. So it's just the days of the judges and tribes, and we have all these big nations around it that are growing. And the Hittites now begin to expand, and in their expansion, they come up against Mitanni, and Mitanni is just no match for the Hittites. The Hittites are going to be the big winners here. Now, as the Hittites are expanding, and the Egyptians are now beginning to expand as well. Remember, they really haven't been out of Egypt since the days of Thutmose III. His son Amenhotep II made one foray out, and then stopped, and everything after that just stopped going out. I think that it was perhaps because of the exodus that had taken place, but Egypt didn't talk about their defeats, and we're going to see how that takes place. Now we're entering the days of Ramses II, and in the year 1295 thereabouts, you have King Muwatalli of the Hittites, and he is going to be leading his army south, and Ramses II is going to be moving north, and these two armies are going to clash at a place called Kadesh. Now, not Kadesh Barnea, which is south of Canaan, but a northern Kadesh on the Orontes River. And the battle will be one of the most significant and historic battles in all of ancient history. We actually have two accounts of the Battle of Kadesh. The Egyptian account, and actually both accounts, the Egyptian account and the Hittite account, both tell the same story, that Ramses was moving north, and he had intercepted two Hittite, supposed to be Hittite deserters, but really they were spies, and they tell the story to Ramses that the Hittites, and the Hittites here are marked in purple. The Hittites are 100 miles away, and they heard you were coming. They heard how great you were, and so they've run away and they're hiding because you're so great and wonderful. And of course, Ramses believed that about himself, so he believes it, and so he has 4 divisions: the Ammon, the Reb, the Ptah, and the Set division. They're named after various gods of Egypt. They receive this false report. They're moving north, and so Ramses goes in pursuit. He says, "Okay, I can, they're nowhere close to me." Meanwhile, they're hiding just on the other side of the city of Kadesh, and so that little brown sort of thing that represents Kadesh, not realizing that the Hittite forces were just on the other side of the city, just around the corner. And so, he's moving forward, and meanwhile, some of the elements of his army, they're crossing a ford in the Orontes River. And whenever you're crossing a ford, you're not, your army slows up, and maybe I don't know if they had to go single file, but it's taking a lot longer for the Ptah and the Set divisions to catch up. And so the army is now getting sort of strung out in a long column. And so they're moving up, and at just this time, the Hittite force moves up and they attack. They're going to attack across the river. So Ramses, he's moved up to a position just northwest of the city of Kadesh. And it's starting to get a little bit late, and he needs the rest of his army to eventually catch up with him. So the Ammon army actually sets up camp. And the Ray and the Ptah and the Set divisions, they're strung out. They're trying to catch up by the end of the day. And the Hittites, they attack across the Orontes River, and they attack the column of the Ray division when it's not ready to fight. They're not lined up. They're not in attack formation or defense formation. They're not in any formation. They're just walking along, and all of a sudden the Hittites in their chariots, because remember your big attacking force now is your chariots. They're attacking Orontes. They're attacking across the Orontes, and they just obliterate this division. And then they wheel to the north, and they're going to attack Ramses in his camp. Now, as I said, at this point, both accounts, we have the account of Ramses, because he's going to tell the story when he gets back to Egypt, and we also have the written account of the Hittites, and they tell identical stories so far. Pretty close. Close enough for government work. And the remnants of the army come running into the camp, or the remnants of that division, and it just throws the camp into confusion. And they come in to attack the camp. And Ramses, his troops aren't ready. They're getting their cooking gear out. They're not ready for battle. Now Ramses tells the story, and this is actually the scene, the way it's depicted on Abu Simbel. And he says, I jumped into my chariot with the jaws of a crocodile. I smote them, and I went out against them, and I defeated them single-handedly. I mean, that's his story of it. The Hittites were attacking, and he just single-handedly beat them all. What happened really when we read the Hittite version of events, because remember, Ramses, he's sort of larger than life, at least in his own eyes. But the Hittites tell the story how they stopped to, they'd basically beaten Ramses, but now they stopped to plunder the camp and loot the camp. And while they're doing that, maybe he does do a quick counterattack just to get out of there. And he takes the remnants of his army and he goes back to Egypt. And he goes back to Egypt, and he tells everybody how he has won against the Hittites. And eventually he builds, in his 20th year, quite a number of years later, when maybe memories have faded a little bit, he builds his famous temple at Abu Simbel. Of course, he's building temples all up and down Egypt. But at this particular temple, he builds at Abu Simbel, and he tells the story there of his one great battle. Of course, that's the only one he fought, but his one great battle against the Hittites at Kadesh, and how he single-handedly defeated them all. Of course, he never goes back out of Egypt again. There's no further campaigns, and eventually he's going to enter into a treaty with the Hittites, and eventually he's going to take a Hittite bride. Will be sealed. Now, she won't be. This Hittite bride won't be his first wife, won't be the major, but he will take a Hittite bride, just to seal that alliance with the Hittites. And so when we read, and for many years we had just Ramses' version. When we finally discovered the Hittites, we got to read the other side of the story, and suddenly the rest of history, the rest of Egyptian history, made a lot of sense. That Ramses, it wasn't that great victory. It was, maybe it was actually a tactical defeat. But he made it back to Egypt intact and pulled all the arrows out of his armor and chariots and things like that, and got back and said, "Hey, then he declared a victory. Hey, we won, but let's not do that again. And so his telling of the story, this is revisionist history, and we talked early on about revisionist history. This is revisionist history at work. It was at work back then, and I hate to say it, I think maybe it's even at work even today at times. Well, 1200 BC is going to come, and we were in 1295 BC with the Battle of Kadesh, and now we're going to see migrations. And we're going to have Indo-European groups moving down into Greece and upsetting things, and will give rise to the Mycenaean civilization. We're going to see some of those pushed out into Crete, and that's going to bring the final, sort of the death blow to the Minoan civilization, although that will really largely have fallen a couple of hundred years earlier. I'm going to have groups move across the Aegean, and the Greeks for 1,000 years later would still be telling the story of the attack on Troy. And that happens around the time of these migrations, around 1200 BC. But we also have Indo-European groups moving across Anatolia and coming against this Hittite Empire, and the Hittite Empire attacked from the south and the north and every which way. It now crumbles and is left in the guise of many small little city-states. There are still Hittites, not like Hittites just disappeared. We're still going to see them. Sometimes they'll be mercenaries. Sometimes they'll be like, remember Uriah the Hittite in the days of David. King David was in the Israelite army. But he's not part of the Hittite army, he's part of the Israelites. So he's sort of working as a mercenary, loyal to David. David wasn't so loyal to him, but loyal to David. But that's going to be the shape of the Hittite kingdoms now after 1200. We also have the Sea Peoples during this time coming down, trying to invade Egypt. And Ramses the Third of the 20th dynasty, no relation to Ramses the Second, just carried the same name. He withholds them and allows that group, at least a portion of them, to settle in southern Canaan, where they will become the Philistines.